This meeting is now being recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your Quality IFSP and Outcomes, QIO, Assessment Tool Training. Today, we're going to go over some background information about the QIO, which will be a recap from the presentation we did, I think, several months back now during your Community of Practice call. It was the intro to the QIO, so we'll just recap some of that information. Go over scoring, so how do we score quality? We'll do a brief demo to look at the tool, and I sent out the link ahead of time, so hopefully you had some time to play around in the practice tool. We'll go over the timeline for QIO activities, talk about what we do with results, discuss what's next, and then we'll have a question and answer at the end, but feel free to type questions into the chat at any time as we go through the training. And you're all on mute right now, but I'll take a couple pauses for questions as well. So on to the background information. What is the QIO? It's a web-based tool that provides objective criteria for examining IFSP and outcome quality, and this allows us to assess IFSP quality in a standardized way. Why are we using the QIO? So it's the evaluation component of our ESSIP, and it helps to show the relationship between Go For It activities and quality. It also allows us to measure changes in quality over time, identify statewide training needs, identify strengths, and CCBs, you guys can identify internal training needs and use this data for succession planning. And how does this fit into what we're already doing? This table here is kind of like a series of umbrellas. So the largest one is our ESSIP, our State Systemic Improvement Plan, and that's our multi-year plan for improving results for infants and toddlers with disabilities. And that includes 3 phases. We had our data analysis, the planning, and now we're in implementation and evaluation. Within our ESSIP, we have our SIMMER, and that's our State Identified Measurable Result, which is the long-term goal of the ESSIP. And that is that infants and toddlers who receive early intervention services in Colorado will demonstrate increased growth in the use of appropriate behaviors to get their needs met. So underneath that, we have Go For It, which you are all very familiar with, and that is the implementation of our improvement strategy to meet that long-term goal. And then we have our QIO, the Quality IFSP and Outcomes Assessment Tool. And that is the evaluation of our improvement strategy implementation. We also have an infographic available with more detailed information about our ESSIP and how everything fits together. That's what that link is at the bottom of this slide. It's kind of hard to see right now, but I will post this training so you can access that link as well. So where did the tool come from? We adapted the tool from a couple of sources. One is Naomi Youngren, and she's with the Educational and Development Intervention Services for the Department of Defense. And then we also used the Kansas Quality Indicator rubric. So we combined the two and then adapted it to be our own. And the QIO assessment tool has been designed to align with the IFSP form itself, the data system, and the IFSP training and instruction manual. And we are still working at getting that even more closely aligned, which I'll talk a little more about later. Our first cohort for Go For It and the EI State team participated in 2 phases of testing, and the feedback was used to finalize the first version of the tool, and that's what we're using now. And a work group is currently underway to revise and update it even more. So we should have a new and improved tool by July. Who uses the QIO? So qualified QIO assessors, and that's all of you guys. You can decide to shift the responsibility around if you get into the process and realize you need more or you need less assessors, feel free to do that at any time. Just remember that assessors need to be in a manager-supervisor role that oversees service coordinators in some capacity. So EI coordinators, lead service coordinators, supervisors, and then they also need to be well-versed in go-for-it expectations and high-quality IFSP components because we are relying on the assessors to be to have that expertise. And the state team will also be using the QIO for verification purposes. I'll pause here. Does anyone have any questions related to where it came from, why we're using it? And let me unmute you, or feel free to type in the chat. I actually can't unmute from my view right now, so type in the chat if you have a question, and we'll answer that for you. All right, so now on to scoring. How do we measure the overall quality of an IFSP? We broke this down into 3 sections that coincide with the IFSP. So it's family assessment. Oh, and it looks like we have a question. Sorry, if you don't supervise service coordinators, can you be a reviewer? And why don't you reach out to me directly and we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that situation. It doesn't always need to be a direct supervisor of the service coordinators, but someone that's in a position overseeing service coordinators in some way. So if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out and we can talk through your particular situation. Okay, so back to the scoring. We have our 3 sections of the IFSP and the QIO that relate to each other. So we're using the family assessment, including priorities, concerns, and resources, global outcomes, and IFSP outcomes, which includes the entire plan of action. So as I said, the QIO tool is broken out into these 3 sections as well. So once we have the quality rating for each of these 3 sections, we average them to get the overall quality rating for the IFSP. The next question is, how do we figure out the quality rating for each section? And this is where our rating scale comes into play. We're using what we call a 5-point analytic rating scale. We have our 5 ratings, so they're not acceptable, somewhat acceptable, acceptable, emerging best practice, and best practice. The QIO tool provides descriptors under not acceptable, acceptable, and best practice in the form of a statement with a checkbox item, like this. So this is a screenshot of the family assessment section of the QIO tool, which aligns with the same section of the IFSP. We've also included a missing required information column, and this is for those black and white things that are required on the IFSP. If any of these things are missing, so in other words, if you check any of those items, the overall section score must be a 0. And I will talk a little more about that when we get to determining overall section score in the demo. So again, the ratings of not acceptable, acceptable, and best practice coincide with the 3 columns on the QIO that list clarifying descriptors. So now, where do these in-between scores of somewhat acceptable and emerging best practice come into play? Those ones come into play when we're applying the overall section score. So first, you would check the items that apply to the IFSP you're reviewing. Then you click the Calculate buttons, and that allows you to see how many items you checked in each area. So for this one, we have half of the acceptable items checked and 1 in not acceptable. So as the assessor, I would apply an overall section rating of somewhat acceptable. And this is an example of where those in-between ratings on the scale come into play. Now, before we jump into the demo, I'll unmute you guys just a second here. Sorry about that.
All guests have been unmuted.
Okay, you're unmuted if anyone has questions about the scoring.
If you have the majority marked in acceptable or whatever category, and you just have one marked in the lower category, or vice versa, maybe it's, you know, one in best practice, you always choose the one in the middle, or is it, you know, somewhat?
That part is somewhat subjective, and so that's why we are having the assessor decide the overall section score rather than just relying on the calculations. So you can think about what is that one item that you checked in not acceptable. Is it important enough to pull the weight down, or is it pretty minor and you checked everything in acceptable? So you can kind of weigh out what particular items you did and didn't check and decide if they need to weight heavily enough to skew the score. And that can be subjective. So, you know, you might do it and rate it somewhat acceptable and then I rate it acceptable or vice versa, and that's okay because we do have that room for subjectivity right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions about scoring before we move on?
I have one. This is Sue. I noticed, and this is probably kind of nitty the woods, but I noticed on one of them about like you get scored down for having fragments, like a not complete sentences.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking I've seen things where when you read it, it all makes sense, even though it's not in complete sentences. I'm wondering how important is that?
And so the checkbox items were developed in collaboration with the Program Initiatives Unit based on how we trained Go For It. And we're also reviewing the checkbox items right now to determine if they need different wording or if they need to be removed or if things need to be added. So we are revising the tool to kind of fine-tune right now.
Well, that would be my recommendation if it mattered. Just, you know, as long as it makes sense and you understand the flow and you know, what is being communicated. But thank you.
And this is Amanda, just to add on that, and I know in our initial work with developing this tool in alignment with the IFSP and the IFSP manual and the trainings, I think our expectation at the point when an IFSP is finalized and complete, and at the point that we would be reviewing it for quality, would be that it would be a final document that you provide to a family that is a narrative and a meaningful document for them. So I think at the point when we're looking at quality, our expectation for an acceptable IFSP would be that it is narrative, reflective of the IFSP, the family assessment, and the outcomes that you've developed with the family. So that's why that item and that checkbox item exists as it relates to an acceptable, high-quality IFSP.
And then we have other teachers from other sites because we're on spring break here. And but generally the model is.
All guests have been muted.
I'm sorry, I was on mute, so you didn't hear anything I was saying for a minute. If you do have questions, feel free to type in the chat. I muted everyone because you're getting quite a bit of noise. But we're going to move on to our demo. And The demo is more to show the flow through the QIO and how you use it. So we're not going to spend a lot of time going through the actual content of the tool. But this is the practice tool that I emailed to you guys, I think earlier this week, maybe yesterday. And the first page has some background information, that rating scale, and then links to the user guide. Then we move on to the next page. You enter your email address, and that allows you to receive a copy of the QIO you completed. We enter the IFSP number, the record type, which right now we're only looking at initial IFSPs, IFSP meeting date, and then the age at IFSP development. And we have a calculation tool that you can use to determine that if you don't want to do the math in your head. So we'll enter a birth date, and then the date that the IFSP was developed, calculate, and we're looking at months, so 13.1. Select your CCB, the service coordinator's name, and then you can select the area of delay. And we're making updates to this right now to include categorical, and then in the title, informed opinion as well. And we're entering that here so that we can reference it later, and I'll show you where that pulls over to. We have this scoring reminders box at the bottom of each section. So it pulls over the level of the area of delay, and then the child's age so that you can reference that as you are rating the IFSP. So if I were rating an IFSP, I'd have that up right now, and we recommend the print PDF view of the IFSP because it's easier to bounce around without having to click in and out of different sections. We have a purpose of that section, and then an example also on each page. So I would go through, make sure all the required information is there. We'll pretend that it is for this one. And then I'll read all of these clarifying statements and check the ones that apply to the IFSP that we're reviewing. And I'm just randomly checking some right now. So now at the bottom, we'll calculate the total, and that allows us to see how many we checked in each column. And then that also serves as a visual aid to guide us in deciding our overall section score. So for this one, there's a few acceptable items that aren't checked that I would think are important. We have some in not acceptable, so I would apply somewhat acceptable. And we can move on to the next page, which is global outcomes. So let's say for this one, we're missing some information in required info. The strengths is left blank, but everything else is pretty acceptable. However, if we check anything in missing required information, we have to give that section a score of not acceptable. So the calculation buttons are removed for best practice and acceptable to help you remember that. So I would give not acceptable for this section. Now we're on the IFSP outcomes section, and this is the longest one because we have it broken down into all parts of the plan of action. So the first one is the priority. What is the priority this outcome will address? And I'm going to say it's acceptable. It was directly pulled from your family's priorities in the on the family assessment section. We have our IFSP outcome, which we can copy and paste into that box. And remember to remove children's names from that. So I'll check my items here that apply, strategies, measurable criteria, where are you starting, how will you know when the IFSP outcome is achieved. So there's a couple of things on here that have been tricky. So the timeline and the measurable pieces have given people some it can be difficult to remember the difference between the two. So the measurable piece refers to things like 2 times per week, 1 meal per day, at bedtime, etc. The timeline refers to the period of time that this should happen in order for the parents to know that the outcome was met. So for example, over 1 month until Johnny's 2nd birthday, by our family's vacation in June. So if we look at the example on the QIO for this section, it says Mia will play quietly and go to sleep within 30 minutes of Joanna putting her in her crib at bedtime, 5 days per week for 1 month. So for this one, 5 days per week is the measurable component, and for 1 month is the timeline. So we're looking for a timeline beyond the next more specific than the next 6-month review or annual review. So that's why we have timeline is missing or only defined by the reviews, or the timelines are based on a realistic point of reference. If you have any questions about that, feel free to type in the chat, and we can address those now too. The global outcomes addressed, this section has also been a little tricky. In most cases, we should only see one global outcome listed, and you can remember the function of the IFSP outcome to help you determine which one is more closely aligned. We're seeing multiple global outcomes selected, especially for goals around speech and communication. So for example, if we had an IFSP outcome that said, Johnny will use 1 word to request what he would like to eat at snack time every day for 2 weeks, we'll often see acquiring and using knowledge and skill and taking appropriate action to meet needs. However, because of the function of this outcome, it's to request what he wants to eat. The most closely aligned one is take appropriate actions to meet needs. So for that example, if both were selected, then I would choose not acceptable because one or more of those global outcomes indicated did not align with the IFSP outcome. So it's just important to remember the function of the outcome when you're rating that section. And for this one, I have the majority of acceptable, a couple not acceptable, but I don't think they weigh heavily enough to pull it down, so I'll do acceptable. This is our final page where our overall quality rating score is calculated, and then we can see what we got in each section. And again, it's the average of those 3 equals our overall quality. Then we can tie it down to our rating scale. So for this example, the IFSP has an overall quality rating of 1, which is somewhat acceptable. Then you submit it, and you will receive an email with a copy of what you just submitted, and we receive it in the back end of the website that we have our form built in. So you don't have to send anything to us. You submit it, and you're done. Let me go ahead and try to unmute you
All
again.
guests have been unmuted.
Does anyone have questions about the tool itself?
Seems like there were a couple of spots practice in there.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. A couple of spots that
A measurable criteria or have a best practice column. Did I see that right?
Yeah, so we do have a best practice column for most areas. There are a couple that don't, like the global outcomes one doesn't because is it there or is it not? If it's there, is it the correct one or not? So there isn't really a best practice option because best practice and acceptable are basically the same thing. So there are a couple where that isn't the case.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to mute you guys again. It's pretty loud, but please type
All
in your
guests have been
questions
muted.
in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to those. Okay, so here is our QIO project timeline. And I know some of the smaller text at the bottom is hard to see, but that's okay. Just look at the steps and we'll talk through each of them. We also have this available through a link, so when I send this training out, the PowerPoint, you can go to the link and view this in a less fuzzy version. So the first step of the whole QIO process, oh, and I just saw a question in the chat. What is the average amount of time it takes to complete a QIO rating? So this will vary pretty drastically from when you start and then when you become more comfortable. I think when I first started doing them, it took around half an hour, and now it takes 15 to 20 minutes. It also depends on how much content there is on the IFSP. So the ones that fall more towards not acceptable or somewhat acceptable are a lot quicker to rate than the ones that are on the higher end of the scale because there's more to review. Okay, so back to our timeline. The first step is full implementation of Go For It, which you're already complete with. Step 2 is the QIO tool training, which is what we're doing now. And then we also have a user manual that's available. Step 3 is to collect baseline data, so that's our next step. We have a data analyst that pulls our IFSP samples for us, and for our baseline, we're looking at the first month that your entire phase was fully implemented with Go For It. And for you guys, I believe that's February. To collect our baseline data, the CCVs, you guys will complete self-assessments on a sample of those IFSPs, and we will verify the same list of IFSPs. So it's kind of a good practice go because we're looking at all the same IFSPs and we can compare scores between the two. It's a good way to get used to the tool, and then we have baseline data to look at when we get further down the line. Step 4, ongoing monthly self-assessments and verifications. So we do the same process for pulling an IFSP sample list. And I will share that with you guys through a Google Sheets document that you can access using a link. And the benefit of doing it that way is sometimes we need to replace a link because the wrong client case status is listed or something happened where the sample pulled in an IFSP that shouldn't be rated because it isn't complete for one reason or another. So it's nice to have it all in one place. I can replace the link without causing too much confusion, and that link will stay the same. So just save that link off somewhere. If you have a Google account, you can find it within your Google Sheets. If you don't have a Google account, the link will get you there anytime that you need it. And we will be completing verifications on a sample of your self-assessments every month as well. Step 5, monthly results. So we will provide you with results every month that include the verification scores, the ratings over time, the percent agreement between self-assessment and verification, and some strengths and areas for growth. We also share results with the Program Initiatives Unit to discuss support needs. Step 6 is to phase out of verification. So this will be quite a ways down the road for you guys. Self-assessments will continue as normal at that point. However, we will only verify the ones that you've rated as a 2 or higher. And then once we've had the same ratings of those 2 or higher for 3 consecutive months, then we will solely rely on the self-assessment scores and periodically verify. And it might be a little too much information for right now, so don't worry about that step. It'll be quite a ways out for you. We also want to incorporate some observation of the IFSP meetings to tie what's happening in practice to what's documented and make sure that we're getting a holistic view. We want to use the QIO data to see if quality is affecting IFSP outcome performance and to see if it's affecting global outcome performance. And then finally, we'll use the data to evaluate our simmer. And these are the different phases, and the dates on there are the baseline data. So we have our first phase started in October of 2016, and that consists of Imagine, Inspiration Field, Mountain Valley, North Metro. Our second phase, we did the baseline in July of 2017. Blue Peaks, Community Connections, Foothills Gateway, Rocky Mountain Human Services, Starpoint, and TRE. And then we have you guys, and your baseline will be February of 2018. We have Colorado Blue Sky, Community Options, DDRC, Envision, Horizons, and Strive. And then our final phase of QIO will be Developmental Pathways, Eastern, Southeastern, and Southern. So this information might be helpful for you to reference back to the phases that have been using the tool for a while. I think they'll be a great resource if you have questions beyond the support that we're providing to you. So again, we'll provide you with monthly reports, and I already went over this in our timeline, so I'll skip this slide. How can we use this QIO data? So as you guys can use it to identify internal training needs, implement your own quality assurance improvement strategies and for succession planning. And statewide, we're using them to identify statewide training needs. We had a family assessment workshop that the Program Initiatives Unit made available to some communities based on some of those more global needs that we identified through the QIO. We use the data to ensure alignment between the QIO, IFSP, and EI data system, and report on whether improvement strategies from our SIP are being implemented as intended and making a difference. So what's next? We call the QIO cycle our Manic Mondays because everything falls on a Monday, and there's a lot of dates to remember. But once you get in the groove, it's not hard to remember. So on the second Monday of every month, you'll receive your IFSP samples, and that's the list that will be available through the Google Sheets to self-assess. So that starts April 9th, and again, this is your baseline, so it's a good practice. Don't worry about doing it perfectly. It's your first go at using the tool. Also, please remember not to use your QIO link to assess any IFSPs outside of the sample list because we are pulling that as data. If you want to assess other IFSPs, you're welcome to use that practice tool, and we certainly encourage use of that tool as well. So I'll send you a separate link for your ongoing self-assessments. You have the practice link now, which I'll send out again. On the fourth Monday of every month, self-assessments are due. So you have 2 weeks to complete the self-assessment. We're going to be getting the IFSP list sooner at the beginning of the month to give you an extra week. And I think we we won't be able to do it for April, but in May, we'll get that to you by the first week. Then on the first Monday of every month, results are distributed for 2 months prior. So those are the results that we'll be sharing with you and the Programs Initiatives Unit. And that will start June 4th. We also have a chatter group, so you can post questions. I'll put reminders in there for when things are due. And that's a good spot, like the Unicorn chatter group, just to collaborate and post questions. And as I said, we have a work group underway, so a revised tool will be available by July. And that's all I have for you. So I'll open it up for questions now, and I am going to unmute you. So please mute yourself if you're in a busy, loud environment.
All guests have been unmuted.
Are there any questions? Who does the IFSP list go to each month? So whoever I have on my list of assessors that you guys sent to me, I'll send you the Google Sheets link, and then that link, hold on to it because that's what you'll access every month to see your IFSP list.
Do you have an on-site staff because I know that and your person takes extensive training. Yes. Do you have an on-site training people? We do for certain components, and then we bring outside. So we have trainers for 30 plus that are on.
How many IFSPs are reviewed for large, medium, and small CCBs? That's a really good question that I meant to address, so I'm glad you brought it up. For the largest CCB we have right now, the most they've had in 1 month is 20. And for small CCBs, it can be anywhere from 0 to 1, depending on how many IFSPs were completed that month. The sample is pulled based on how many IFSPs were completed that month with a 95% confidence interval, so that ensures the data we're collecting is significant. And we have another question. Will we be downloading Google Sheets? No, you don't need to download anything. It's just a link. If you have it downloaded, you can certainly use it, but you don't need to access your list. It'll just be a URL.
So school definitely is invested in teachers, having trainings, and I would say all of us, most teachers are, they're learners for life and are.
Anything else?
Learning things, and there's more research all the time, so school really wants to support that. The teachers,
All right. Well, feel free to reach out and post in the chatter if questions do come up. I'm sure once you get into using the tool, some more questions will come up. So reach out at any time. Pretty easy to understand, someone said in the chat, so I'm glad about that. And we're excited. I hope you are too. So I'll look out for an email that I'll send by April 9th with your first list. And thank you all for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day.